Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the organizers for pulling the panel together, and thanks to all of you for sharing your lunch hour with us. I know that Canada is often discussed in copyright circles, especially for the last number of years, sometimes as a model for what people think ought to be done, and sometimes by others who think that it's a cautionary tale of what can happen when you adopt fairly flexible approaches with respect to limitations and exceptions in education. What I'd like to do is provide you with some of the facts of what's taking place, and it's a timely time to be doing that because we're conducting a review of our law, and for the first time I think we have far more data that's been brought forward, and it's continuing, in terms of what in fact has been happening in Canada over the last number of years. So my goal really is to do two things. First, quickly, for those that aren't familiar, give you a bit of a refresher in terms of what Canada did in 2012, and then talk a bit about what's happened since. Now, in terms of what took place in 2012, we had both legislative reform that had been more than a decade in the making, as well as some major Canadian cases. The legislative reform, referred to as the Copyright Modernization Act, covered a really broad range of issues. And of relevance, particularly for this panel, was the inclusion of some additional limitations and exceptions, or as our Supreme Court of Canada would call them, users' rights, including the inclusion of education as one of our fair dealing purposes. There are a range of other exceptions or users' rights that were built into the law, including a provision for non-commercial user-generated content, a provision within education where materials were publicly available on the internet, as well as provisions designed to facilitate both distance education and interlibrary loans from a digital perspective. There were also the inclusion of anti-circumvention provisions, the so-called digital locks, as well as tougher rules with respect to websites that might enable infringement activities, often referred to as the enabler provision. So we had a pretty broad range of changes that took place within the law. At the same time, we had the Supreme Court of Canada issue what has been referred to as the copyright pentology, because there were 5 copyright decisions issued by our Supreme Court in a single day. It touched on, again, a broad range of issues, strongly affirming a user rights orientation with respect to limitations and exceptions, arguing that copyright, as we heard from many delegations earlier, fundamentally about striking a balance and talking about the balance being both between creator rights on the one hand, users' rights on the other, and the need for a broad liberal interpretation of fair dealing to give rise to that notion of balance. I should note that the court's decisions looked at the education context, but it did so without a specific exception or purpose for education. It relied on research and private study, which were already within the law in order to do so. Now, where that left fair dealing in Canada is that it is viewed by our court as a user's right, and it's a two-part test, similar to what you'll find in many jurisdictions, including some fair use jurisdictions. The first is that there are a series of enumerated purposes in Canada. There are now 8: research, private study, education, news reporting, criticism, review, parody, and satire. Our Supreme Court has ruled that there should be a low threshold for meeting one of those purposes. And the reason for that is that the fairness analysis comes in part 2 of the test, and there is a 6-part test to determine fairness, taking a look at the amount that's being used, its effect, the nature of the work, the kinds of things that I think will be familiar to many who have looked at these sorts of issues. In the aftermath of that, education groups came up with guidelines that landed at roughly 10% of a work, although that can vary depending on the circumstance. And there was a great emphasis on copyright compliance. So today, many educational institutions now have copyright officers in-house, emphasizing the need to comply with copyright rules. Well, what's happened since? Now, we've had, of course, in the last 5 years, a wide range of cases, certainly, that have taken place. Perhaps best known in the educational context is a case between York University and one of the copyright collectives, Access Copyright, which ruled that some of these guidelines were offside. That case is currently under appeal. We've also had a number of cases that that have really taken a look at the importance of fair dealing or limitations exceptions from an expression perspective. The Vancouver Aquarium involved a documentary filmmaker who was being stopped from using certain clips that he had filmed within the aquarium, and the court ruled that fair dealing could be used to ensure that that film could be brought out to the public. Similarly, Roomful of Spoons, which involves a documentary on a well-known film It was the subject of a James Franco movie, The Room, just this past year. There was a lawsuit brought by the creator of that film based on the use of clips from the original movie. And again, the court relied on fair dealing as a rationale to allow the film to proceed. We've also engaged in reform with respect to the Copyright Board, or are about to do so. We've seen a term extension for sound recordings. There's been the Marrakesh Treaty implementation. So things have remained active, notwithstanding what we saw in 2012. Right now is a very active time in Canada with respect to copyright. We're reviewing the law led by the Industry Committee, but there's also review taking place at the Heritage Committee, and it's looking at issues such as fair dealing, as well as the so-called value gap and the like. We've also had the government announce that it is going to introduce either regulations or legislation dealing with intellectual property abuse. Patent trolling or misuse of copyright and trademarks are the kinds of things that the government wants to explore and put into legislation as part of an effort both to ensure that there is effective enforcement, but at the same time there is not misuse of some of those rules. Now, quickly, what has happened since then in the market? And I recognize that there are those that argue that somehow licensing has disappeared and that millions of dollars have been taken away. Sometimes the amount that I've seen exceeds by double the amount that the Copyright Collective has ever generated. And so some of these numbers strike me as entirely implausible. But I think that there are three things that have, based on the data, fundamentally taken place in Canada. The first is that education has spent more, not less, when it comes to copyright materials. So we have these rules with respect to fair dealing, but yet when we take a look by education, institution after institution is now spending more. This is from Dalhousie University, a university located on the east coast of Canada, taking a look at its upward increasing spending that's taken place on copyright materials. It's a similar story with Ryerson University, located in Toronto, in Ontario. In fact, if you look at the Ryerson data, what you find is that there has been a decline in the spending on print, and there has been, of course, an increasing spending both on database access, site licensing, as well as on electronic books. Electronic books wasn't even a line item in 2012 for these institutions, and yet today many of these institutions have become digital first, buying electronic books rather than buying print-based publications. And in fact, data from the government, from Statistics Canada, confirms that library acquisition spending on copyright has increased. I should note that there is also now far more data, as we're starting to see open data adopted, so there's a great deal of transparency with respect to the spending. This table here comes from the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, a consortia of the largest universities in Canada, who in the last fiscal year spent more than $80 million on site licenses with the largest publishers from around the world, and they break it down based on the various providers. There are even institutions that break it down to the penny, how much they spend on every single book and serial that takes place. So this comes, for example, from the University of Alberta, which has an open data archive that breaks down spending with every provider and tells you precisely what they have purchased. Many of these licenses being purchased on a perpetual basis, so that they have effectively bought the rights to use and use in course materials on an ongoing basis. The second thing we know is that publisher profit margins in Canada since 2012 have increased. Yes, they have increased. This data, again, coming from Statistics Canada, that tells us that even in the Canadian environment, we have seen larger profit margins with respect to publishers increasing over the last number of years, and corresponding to that, Canadian publisher education revenues. So the Canadian publishers, the revenues that they are generating in the education sector, Statistics Canada data tells us it has also increased in the last number of years. This with fair dealing in place. And the reason that I think we see this taking place is that when you take a look at the data, it is licensing that has remained the foundation of access. And so that notion, and Teresa brought it up, that limitations and exceptions do not end licensing is precisely the experience that we have seen in Canada. Flexible fair dealing, to be sure, but licensing still at the heart of how things are accessed. For example, this comes from the University of Guelph, located in Ontario, which took a look at how they acquire materials for their course e-reserves. The largest circle, the largest portion of the pie there in blue is site licensing. So the majority of the course e-reserves are still coming from site licenses. The second largest piece there in orange is from open access materials. Open access now almost a quarter of all materials, consistent with the OER discussion that we had earlier. The smallest one in gray is from transactional licenses. And so we see in institutions that even where they have fair dealing, oftentimes they'll say this doesn't meet the fair dealing standard, and institutions are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars with publishers on transactional licenses for single use. The last piece there is fair dealing, constituting at the University of Guelph 16% of their use for course e-reserves. It is a relatively small portion of overall course materials. It is even smaller at the University of Calgary. They took a look at a survey of thousands of e-learning materials, taking a look at here's the e-learning materials, how are we finding them being used? Fair dealing constituted just 8% of the course e-materials, of thousands of materials that were examined at the University of Calgary. The vast majority, again, coming from site licenses and as well as open access. A work that I've been doing more recently at the University of Ottawa focuses specifically on the increasing licensing of electronic books. And this chart reflects the fact that institutions are purchasing the e-licenses first, very often with licenses that fully allow the integration of those electronic books within their course materials, whether that's in an electronic course management system or otherwise. And so what we did was take a look at just one of the electronic databases that was subscribed to in Canada, specifically at Canadian book publishers, because there's been an emphasis on what is the implications for the domestic industry. We got a sense from the CRKN data that there is still big spending on the international publishers. And what this chart highlights is at the top, in the orange, which typically is slightly longer, in the case of the publisher McGill Queen's a little bit longer, are the number of electronic books that are available for subscription through this database provider. In blue are the number that are actually being subscribed. And so what we see is that at an institution, in this instance my own, we are finding that the number of books available, and this is books that have been published since 1997, which our Copyright Collective says are the most likely to be copied. They say it's very rare to see materials from books copied that are more than 20 years old. What they have found is that the institutions will license virtually everything that is made available. The reason, in a sense, is obvious, because fair dealing, while essential and very valuable, at the same time still does not provide all the rights that are needed. And for institutions that are acquiring, to ensure that they can integrate this into their e-learning, they are investing heavily. So that's the Canadian reality. In the last 5 years, we've adopted more flexible approaches with respect to fair dealing. Licensing has increased over that time. The importance of open access and OER has become increasingly important as well. And I think the lesson to be taken away from the data to date, now that we have real data, is that fair dealing enhances what takes place within education, and it does not replace books and e-licensing. Thanks very much for your attention.